So, to start off looking at women in the political sphere, we have to start with Chartism. Now, before that, however, in 1832, women were explicitly prohibited from voting in the 1832 Reform Act, or otherwise known as the First Reform Act. And before then, there were arguments. There were women, some who tried to vote, and it was in this year, however, for the sake of the presentation, that we'll start just with that year, noticing this is when it's very explicit. Women are prohibited from voting. Now, as Chartism grew from the working class, it was very class-based, and this movement was really centered on, as we've covered in class, on reforms. However, in the People's Charter, enfranchisement for women was included in the beginning. However, it was such a controversial issue that they removed it from the People's Charter. And this was very disappointing for a lot of women, because women, and we're not sure exactly the number, but they formed a very large percentage of the Chartists. They were a fundamental and crucial base for this Reform Act, and their enfranchisement was pretty much ignored. And as we look at what women were doing for this Chartist movement, they were working together, they were talking with other women, they were learning, they were involving themselves in this political sphere, and they were engaged in a conversation with each other. And Chartism allowed this to happen. So this political movement, though it didn't provide women with enfranchisement, did provide an opportunity and an avenue for women to work together for eventually what would come to be women's suffrage. Now, the Chartist movement died, right, it ended in 1848. But these women, like I said, who had been involved in this discourse, involved in this conversation, they had this experience, right, of activism, of working towards this reform. And they started working together, which eventually came to the suffrage movement. Now, I have a lot to cover, but we're going to start off just with this timeline here, just to look at very important years. So as I said, the 1832 First Reform Act, we look at women being explicitly prohibited from voting. Now, we know that the Chartism movement then died in 1848, when we were not provided with enfranchisement. However, in 1867, John Stuart Mill argued in front of Parliament for women to gain suffrage. And this was kind of, as we can say, the beginnings of when these women who had been working together, when suffrage had already been in the discourse, it wasn't like this new radical idea, and this starts already to heat up, right? And in 1872, you have the National Society for Women's Suffrage to be founded. Now, the beginnings of the suffrage movement, we're going to consider, like I said, this attempt, right, for women to organize behind this one cause. The opposition, at the same time, was starting to build up as well. So when you have this movement, right, starting to build, you're going to have its opposition starting to build as well. And in 1897, you have the much more prominent National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies be founded. This organization, like I think the name implies, tried to consolidate these efforts that women were putting forward for suffrage. And eventually, in 1903, you have the Women's Social and Political Union. This is when women's suffrage takes a bit of a turn. Basically, the efforts that women were putting towards obtaining suffrage were confronting very, very strong opponents, including women themselves that we're going to get into, and it starts to become militant, as we covered in class. And this is when you start hearing the word suffragettes, and you start listening about the Pankhursts, and this militant movement really marginalized, was very controversial. However, it did garner a lot of support. However, in 1914, when the First World War begins, this movement ends. And it isn't until 1918, right, so right after the First World War, that the Fourth Reform Act provides enfranchisement for women above the age of 30. Now, as I said, women above the age of 30. That wasn't equal to men. That wasn't until 1928 that they were provided the same opportunities as men over the age of 21. And now I want to transition to this part up here. So to just have this quick dialogue about very important terms in this time. Like I said, you have suffragists and suffragettes. And for the sake of the presentation, I just want to talk about what the difference is. So a suffragist is anyone who supported women's suffrage. However, a suffragette was much more particular in identifying those women who were more militant or activists in a certain portion of the suffragist movement. One implies the other doesn't with the former. Now, when we look also at essentialism and humanism, this is very prominent in understanding the difference between anti-suffragists and suffragists. So just to delve into this for not too long, there was a very prominent movement among women who were not for suffrage. And their argument was that the social fabric of Britain was focused on women being this moral entity, right, that could fortify, right, the domestic sphere and provide Britain with the stability that if they were provided the vote, they would pretty much disregard their responsibilities, their maternal duties. And very prominent feminists, including Mary Wollstonecraft, early feminist philosophers, feminist quotes, was pretty much for this idea of this essentialism that women should play roles in society that men don't, and vice versa. The humanist perspective, however, was argued by suffragists mostly, that women and men shared many characteristics. Now, the word feminist, just to delve into this very quickly, feminist is a very controversial term. A lot of historians and a lot of my research have claimed it to be anachronistic, meaning a lot of these authors who used it basically the word didn't exist at this time. In this presentation, I want to tell you that it was feminism. That word did exist. I've been researching a lot of newspapers that use this term, and over time, obviously, when you talk about intersectionality, when you look at Chartism and how class can differentiate these women, one has to look at how class differences, how eventually racial differences, really affected the message that these women were using with these feminist cause. And just for a quick conversation about today, I just want to make one very solid point, that just because women were able to obtain suffrage doesn't mean that they were equal to men. Legislation doesn't provide women with the equality, right, that men have. Just because they're able to vote, you see in the last election, you see in the representation in the House of Representatives, in Congress, and in local communities, women have not obtained this equality. However, a lot of people argue, well, they were able to vote, so they're equal. And I think that we can learn from this time that this was one of the most prominent attempts at obtaining equality, but equality is still very much something that we have to strive for in our own society.
All right, so now we're going to jump into the social lives of women. And something that largely shaped the social experience of women in the Victorian era was the doctrine of separate spheres. So separate spheres consist of two spheres of space in the Victorian era. So that includes the private sphere, which consists of the home, and that's where the woman is supposed to lead. And this sphere is very closely associated with morality. On the contrary, there is the public sphere, and that was almost exclusively for men, and that basically consists of everything outside of the home, including work, business, politics, the market, etc., and generally the public sphere is considered to be somewhat immoral. So the private sphere deals very closely with Victorian domesticity, and basically the woman was the caretaker of the home, and the home itself was incredibly prized in Victorian society. If you remember earlier in this semester when Professor Kennedy showed us pictures of the Victorian home, how cluttered it was, but yet they really prided themselves on their decorations and how important that was to them. So the woman, her role in the home was cleanliness, whether that be she would clean herself and cooking, or whether she would manage servants to do those things, and also taking care of her children. So these two things are also very closely associated with Victorian morality, as the woman was sort of viewed as the angel in the house. She was really supposed to cultivate virtue in the home and was sort of looked at as the religious leader in that home. And as we can see from this image, you have a woman surrounded by her children, and she's welcoming her husband as he has come home from the day in the ungodly public sphere. And she was supposed to provide that peaceful oasis for him when he came home. Now, of course, we know not all women were confined to the private sphere. For example, you had prostitutes who stand in contrast to the pious housewife that is idealized in the image of the private sphere. So these prostitutes, for many in the Victorian era, they were the image of the public sphere and all of its immorality and debauchery, I suppose. However, you could see why women would turn to this profession, as it was the highest paying job they could get. They got money up front, and they had shorter working hours. Now, conditions, certainly there were risks in all types of like lines of work for women, and it's difficult to argue which is necessarily safer and poses less risk. But some women could view this as a better line of work for themselves. So prostitutes, they actually at one point were estimated to make up 3% of the population of London, which is quite significant. And they sort of covered all different classes. So you would have the lower class prostitutes that worked in brothels and were sort of managed by a madam. Then you had middle class prostitutes, and they were able to pick their own clients and sometimes lived alone. And then there were also the upper class prostitutes, and they catered to upper class clients. They would make a lot of money, they had to be educated, very attractive, and in some cases they would end up marrying those clients. So it was definitely different tiers. Now, prostitution originally was not illegal, however, they would find ways to arrest these women for like gathering in the streets and other things. But eventually in 1847 it was considered illegal by the Town Police Clauses Act, and this crime was punishable by a year in prison. On top of the legality of it, you had a lot of people in the Victorian era who were so concerned with their morality, so they would create these reformatories to rehabilitate these prostitutes and save them, and usually they would stay in those for about 2 years. Now, on top of the separate spheres that women had to deal with, they also had to live up to really high beauty standards. So makeup was closely associated with prostitutes, which, as we just saw, is associated with immorality in the public sphere. So women were supposed to be naturally beautiful, but at the same time perfect. So they had to have perfect skin, red lips, beautiful eyelashes, all of it. They were supposed to have, very small feet, which they would squeeze into these ridiculous shoes and get blisters on their feet. Their hands had to be absolutely perfect. No marks, no signs of aging on their skin, no sun damage. And on top of all of this, we know that they wore very restrictive clothing, their corsets. This only made their duties that they were supposed to carry out every day that much harder.
I will be talking about social life for women in the colonies. My essay, this is actually my study. I'm studying a kind of a case study on women in British India. And it's kind of an intersection of all of the things that we're talking about, but it's a very consolidated study. So I just wanted to talk about the number of stereotypes surrounding British women in the colonial lands. There was the Mem Sahib, who was indifferent to her colonial surroundings and collecting pashmina scarves, or the spinster trying to find purpose. But ultimately, British women would go on to greatly impact the lives of Indian women in the colonies. British women became nurses, teachers, and observers of Indian life. They sought to empower Indian women through improvements in health and education. And indeed, lots of cultural practices held in India, like sati, which is the ritual burning of a widow on her husband's funeral pyre, was largely eliminated due to British women's interference in legislation work. Mission work was also largely responsible for any education provided and promoted for Indian women. However, colonial mindsets pervaded these British women's minds more often than not, leading to books like The Complete Indian Housekeeper and Cook, which describes how to run a house in India with Indian servants. On page 9, it says that we do not wish to advocate an unholy haughtiness, but an Indian household can no more be governed peacefully without dignity and prestige than an Indian empire. So ultimately, this home in the Indian empire is being reflected into the empire itself. The status of women in comparison to ideals of domesticity held by British women and the general British patriarchy was often used as a measure of civilization and was then used to justify imperialism. Women's rights then, or lack thereof, were held to define the British Empire. Yes. And today this reflects the need for intersectionality in feminism, how these British women were using the state of Indian women to define their own rights in their home country across the empire. but ultimately today it shows that we need to regard all women's experiences as special, equal, and important.
Yeah, and similar to what David was saying earlier, how, just because certain legislation was passed, giving maybe women more political rights, certainly in the social experience, women still find a lot of sexism in their lives. You can see that in the image of the 60s housewife in America. She is very reminiscent of the Victorian housewife. She's meant to stay at home, she cooks, she cleans, she takes care of her children, and then her husband comes home after a hard day of work, and she's supposed to be there to greet him and sort of help him relax after his day. And we see, even on a larger scale, women still struggle to enter into the public sphere. And just in general, there's just this struggle of women who are supposed to stay at home and be a housewife, whether that's in the 60s or today. So this is certainly not something that is isolated to the Victorian era.
And then we've talked a lot throughout this semester about kind of the economic landscape that was present in the Victorian era in regards to kind of how class tensions arise and how exactly women factored into what we were looking at economically. So there are two different things that we kind of want to talk about in this economic landscape when it comes to women and women's rights. And so the first kind of side of the spectrum is aristocratic women. So these were women who were rich. They did not have to work. They lived up to this idea of Queen Victoria and the Victorian ideal, where they were passing along values to their children, future generations. They were the epitome of morality, of value, of tradition in all those different ways. And they were expected to be educated enough to kind of run their household, as kind of Sam said, very much present of this idea of women in domestic life. They were in charge of the household, and they were in charge of finances for the households. That include kind of paying the servants, running the servants, making sure everything is correct for their children, educating their children, sending some of them to school, all kind of in that regard. The biggest priority for aristocratic women is their dowry was everything. That was kind of the entirety of their economic incentive. So their highest priority in life was to marry someone of a higher status than they were. And then what would happen after that was it was a cycle. Those who married higher would then educate their children. Their children would be pushed to marry higher as well to kind of continue that standard of tradition and of being up there in the hierarchy in just Victorian society. In addition, there was this idea of institutionalization present very much in aristocratic women's lives. There were unspoken standards. There were explicit rules that they had to follow that were not necessarily written into policy anywhere, but it was just the norms and the idea of it all. So they had to be very careful with what they were doing within the private sphere, but also with what they were doing within the public sphere, because reputation was really everything in that way. And then kind of the last point, like I said, they did not work. Their status was really declared by their clothing. You looked at them and you knew that they were rich. Their home decor was everywhere, and they just dressed really extravagantly in that way. And so kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, we do have women in the workforce. So we have women who are working in factories, who are working in workhouses. They were of a poor class, of the working class, just trying to get by within their families. So a few different things to note here. Women worked in factories, they worked in mills, mines, agriculture, domestic service. They also performed outwork, where they would take work home from the factory just to continue it there. So it's still considering that domestic idea of it all, still while working in the public sphere. But a lot of different things to talk about. These conditions that women were working in were not good. They were very poor. There was dirt. There was poor, working conditions, poor ventilation. The machinery was really awful, terrifying noises. Like, a lot of women sometimes would go deaf just because of the noises surrounding them. In addition, you also had a lot of young girls who were working in these factories, and they found themselves working in the winter. They did not have sustainable clothing to get them by. They would get sick. They didn't have enough food to eat. They were not able to bathe that often. Many women who were working in these work environments had diseases. They would get phosphorus poisoning from all of the matches, or they had lung problems from just working in the cotton mills. So it wasn't good. And while they were also dealing with all of these external conditions, they were also dealing with internal problems in which all of the men in the workforce working with them strongly opposed what they were doing. There was this idea of competition, and men did not want women to be in the workplace with them. They considered that women should be in the home working in that way. Women at this point were earning 2/3 to 1/2 of what men were earning just for identical work. We'll talk about that in terms of contemporary comparison as well. but just this idea that men really didn't want them there, so they were not good to these women. A lot of the times men would form exclusionary trade unions that would actually strike women's work within the workforce. They'd be like, we don't want to work here when these women are also working here. So this just continued idea of discrimination on a sexist basis. And then also you had people like middle class reformers like Charles Booth and Henry Mayhew, who are just right up here, who strongly opposed women workers. They were moralists, and so they would write books like Charles Booth wrote Life and Labor of the People in London, which spoke about how like married women within the workforce had a mysterious effect on younger girls, and they were setting that wrong impression for young girls that would carry on through generations. Henry Mayhew wrote about like the truthfulness of the poor in his work, so he'd write about women in the workforce, and he'd write about prostitutes, and just kind of like discern what the poor exactly meant with the grotesqueness and the dirtiness that were encompassed within them. And then kind of the last thing is there was a lot of legislation that affected this as well. So the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act that abolished outdoor relief and established the workhouse, so that increased like employment of women and children as families struggle to stay out of the workhouse. Then you have a bunch of factory acts within the 1830s and 1840s that established laws for children to work. So children under 9 couldn't work in the workhouse, and children between 9 and 13, they had limited hours. So it started to bring an end to these young girl child workers, which was good. But then we continue to see acts like the Factory and Workshops Consolidation Bill of 1878. This extended the restrictions on women's labor that had been created by the 1874 Act. So it made sure that they were working in industries other than textiles. They would not be able to work in those industries. Like they were still stuck on these like kind of maternal jobs sort of things where they're working with clothing, they're working with fabric. It also reduced the hours of their labor, and it kind of unified the laws regulating specifically the work of children and women within these workhouses. So just to make some comparisons really quickly, obviously there was a gender and wage gap. Like we said, 1/2 to 2/3 is what women were earning to what men were earning around them. I got the statistics in 2016. White women were earning 80.5 cents to every white man's dollar. Women of color earn much less than that at this point. So we still see this gender wage gap that is occurring. In 1963, the United States did try to introduce an Equal Pay Act. It did not work out. They tried again in 2010. It still did not work out. Goes to show that this economic incentive to have women on a standard that is on par with men is not happening, like in the contemporary United States. So we really haven't come that far in 2018 as we continue to see women getting paid less for identical work to the men around them. In addition, this idea of feminine jobs, like when women were restricted to specifically working in textile work, shows that there's an idea of what exactly a woman should be doing. We are slowly seeing the gender gap being closed in a lot of different professions today, which is great, but it's still not coming that far. When you think of a doctor, you think of a man. When you think of a nurse, you think of a woman. Everything in that realm, we don't see a lot of women in STEM. We still, like David said earlier, have a really big gender gap in political representation. So at this point, like, things are still very similar to how it was in the Victorian area. And then at the end of the day, I brought up just kind of this isolation, opposition to women in the workforce that can be connected to what happens with harassment in the workplace today, which is strongly with the Me Too movement of women continuing to find themselves being discriminated against in both public and private spheres on the basis of gender identity. And that's something that also strongly occurs in the workplace, where men continue to pick on women, to sexually harass women, everything like that. It connects back to this idea of the Victorian era.
I'm back. Hi. So I will be talking about arts and education first. For upper class women, their education largely consisted of governesses until the age of 17 and then finishing school. Both of these forms of education were focused on teaching social graces and upper class practices. In Victorian Britain, this largely meant training women to be proper wives. Middle class girls were sent to boarding schools, largely, which had poor conditions, were often unregulated and privately owned. Emily Davis was considered the leader of the education movement. She grew up as a clergyman's daughter and was highly influenced by religion. She even feminized certain religious figures like St. Paul to make it more of a women's game, I suppose. She also used the influence of Christianity to show that faith does not concern gender in this similar vein, and that women possess the same mental aptitude as men to pursue education. After 1870, the education of these girls became a public concern. Many girls attended the Ladies' Academy, which was an institution seen as overcrowded and the girls were undernourished and the education was not an education. Elizabeth Wolstenholme, an important figure in the education movement, claimed that it was a special shame of England to possess almost the worst instructed people of Europe, and that the hour of action is near at hand. She also used national identity against her political opponents, claiming that England has become one nation of Englishmen and another nation of English women. She also blamed upper-class educational structures, stating that women who were taught to dwell on the ideas of social duty and fashion would not know the true value of an education. She also pursued men's education reform first and then women's. We see that she's making a compromise to gain political ground. And perspectives on this by men. John Gregory in the mid-19th century wrote a book called A Father's Legacy to His Daughters, in which he wrote, "Wit is the most dangerous talent that you can possess." And most men believe that women were sent to school in order to become proper wives. So why is it dangerous for women to be educated? Is it still in our society today? Emily Davis argued this point in her book, The Higher Education of Women, claiming that women going to school will not be better wives, just as men going to school will not be better husbands. So what does society expect of us women in concerning our education? So on to women writers in society. A woman's right to freely express herself has always been limited, even in the arts. Her position is often defined by her male counterparts. Literature in the Victorian era became a popular avenue for women to express themselves. Women were not only limited in their ability to write creatively, but they were also scrutinized for their journalistic and informative writing. Women in Victorian Britain established an array of journals and newspapers to address the difficulties of Victorian life for women. For example, the English Woman's Journal, here pictured, was among the first periodicals to report on the progress of women's arts and women's rights education in the mid-19th century. This and many others were crucial supporters of women and their rights to equality. One of the leading figures in women's journals was Emma Patterson, a trade unionist and feminist who founded the Women's Trade Union League. So as we see, that connects to the labor movement. She was also the editor of the Women's Union Journal for 10 years. While Patterson heavily focused on the promotion of trade organization for women's workers, she also advocated for a variety of freedoms that should be granted to women, like expansion of fields of employment and educational opportunities, not giving women typically feminine jobs and giving them more educational opportunities to enter into labor spheres. This journal was specifically instrumental in directing the self-help movement, giving women agency in their own lives. Also, many of these journals published biographical pieces, which helped to assert women in the historical and political narrative of their time. The Women's Writers Club is kind of the culmination of this. It was founded in 1892 by women and for women. Its main purpose was to assist professional women with networking and provide them with a secure environment to find resources outside of men's harassment. Women's rights were promoted by women writers, and women writers found a place in the fight for women's rights. They asserted themselves in spite of the scrutiny into the artistic sphere. And just for contemporary connections, arts and education in the Victorian era do not reflect policy challenges today as much as they reflect on the consistent status of women as undermined and scrutinized members of society meant to keep quiet. Finishing school then and Mrs. degrees now, if you've ever heard of those, now reflect those design paths for women to follow within patriarchal expectations. The arts have often provided women a space for self-expression, self-help, and therefore self-empowerment. We see this from the English Woman's Journal today, then to reductors today. Women have a voice and will find a way to use it, as we see in our ongoing fight for equality. Question.
Well done. Questions? They obviously want questions.
This is sort of a question about essentialism, but so you talk a lot about like separate spheres and like economic disparities that are continuous today. But in terms of like that sort of moral burden, that idea that women have like a certain moral obligation to be separate and distinct, do you think that is also carrying on today in the way these other more practical discrepancies are?
Yes, but not in the same way. I will say that essentialist ideology, I think today is more subversive. I think that back then, you would have these writers very proudly argue in this essentialist and newspapers like The Spectator, which will argue, the essentialist arguments, good for the anti-suffragists. They know their proper place in society. Whereas now, you won't see people say that. However, you also have people argue the essentialist ideology without claiming that. No, a woman is happier without going to college, where she gets a little too excited about a possible future. So it's better for her to stay at home and be. So people kind of argue it without saying it. Whereas back then, I think people were more outwards about being proud essentialists.
In a way that's probably more dangerous.
Yeah, I mean,
Absolutely.
I think like you do, like you see, like I feel like sometimes you do see like pretty like discrimination. I mean, like if a man becomes like the head of a company, then like great for him. If a woman does, well, what about her children? Is she leaving them behind? Is she neglecting her duties? So I think there's just that double standard.
For you, Maria, I was wondering if you came across any instances of intermarriage between Englishmen in the colonies and, say, Indian women, or was that completely out of the question?
I'm having difficulty finding primary sources on that. There's a lot of secondary sources that talk about it. Mostly it was done in the early half of the 19th century before it became, the reason is kind of hard to find, but basically it was promoted for men to travel to India, marry Indian women, or just sleep with them, sow their oats or whatever men are told to do at young ages, and then come back and find a typical British wife. But when British women started coming on missionary trips, it became kind of, to marry an Indian woman became kind of exclusionary, and it was against Indian women. A lot of times the betterment of the betterment of British women in India meant the discrimination against Indian women. Yes, please.
So, to expose my ignorance of the contemporary world, could you explain to me what Mrs. degrees are?
Yeah, you do.
Okay, so I'm a tour guide at GW, and I've gotten this question from multiple moms where they come and they ask, like, is my daughter going to be able to get her Mrs. degree here? And what that means is it's typically a Southern thing, but it's girls who go to college with the idea that their biggest accomplishment in college is going to be they're going to find a man, sort of thing. And it's spring before the spring. So like by the time you graduate, you're engaged and you're gonna get married, and that's the degree that you go searching. And every time a mom asks me, I cringe, but I have to be polite. But it's a real thing at this point where like girls literally come to college, or their parents set them off to college with this idea of like you better like find a man by the time you graduate, because that's the entire purpose. Which connects back to like women who, aristocratic women who are just trying to elevate their own higher status by marrying above them. It's very interesting, and it's also very horrifying at this point.
I have two friends who are in school for that reason. I'm from New York. So.
Yeah.
I'm stunned.
Yeah.
That was we were talking about it in the group, and I didn't know about it, and that was my reaction.
I'm not that stunned.
I think going off of that kind of, I think I often see like instances where men subordinate women to a certain path and route in life. But is there any record of women kind of condemning other women who kind of drift off of that standard?
So basically, and that's my research that I'm doing. It's with the anti-suffragists. They did. They actually worked with the suffragists. So the opposition wasn't women against women so much as certain women believing that the social fabric and the stability of the race and empire required them to not be distracted with having to vote, and they were against the suffragists who were trying to unravel what made Britain so great. So yes, there was that very prominent case of anti-suffragists, and there is, however, a very big differentiation between female anti-suffragists and male anti-suffragists. One was very constructive in the sense that though they were against these suffragists who wanted the vote, they wanted to empower women in other ways by saying, you could do so much at home. Whereas the males really did just focus on, you just shouldn't vote. They didn't care for empowering women in any other way. So, however, there are records of anti-suffragists and suffragists really working together in the essentialist view of, okay, one wanted the vote, one didn't, but they both really fought for this motherly duty. All the women, fulfill your what nature prescribed for you as a mother. So it varied.
Any of the rest of you who were part of this group want to add anything? Or?
Follow our Instagram.
Yeah, follow the Instagram, absolutely. Well, thank you again, fabulous.